Thank you all so much for coming. This is such a great turnout. It's such a joy to be at Powell's in Portland. I'm Antonia Juhasz, and thank you all for being here tonight. I've been on tour now since October 6th, and I have been all over, and it is just a particular thrill for me to be able to be here. I've spoken in Portland a couple times, and maybe some of you have heard me talk, but I've never spoken at Powell's, so it's a real treat to be at Powell's bookstore. So thank you to Powell's for having me, and thank you to Portland for having me. Let's see, where to begin. Just a little bit on my background that might be useful. My background is in public policy. I studied both my undergraduate and graduate degrees are in public policy. I then went to work for two members of Congress in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill for them, and then have worked in various research and nonprofit advocacy organizations. And currently I work with two groups, one that's called the Institute for Policy Studies, the other that's called Oil Change International. And if you get the trend, policy is the trend through both my academic work and my career. And that is the lens through which I view these issues. My previous book was a book called The Bush Agenda, Invading the World One Economy at a Time, which also gives you a sense of my frame of reference. And in that book, I looked at four corporations and their relationship to policy making within the Bush administration. And those companies were Halliburton, the Bechtel Corporation, Lockheed Martin, and Chevron. And in doing that book, which came out in 2006, I came to realize that we had a critically important vacuum in our intellectual research and intellectual information available for our policy making and activist and analytic work, which was that essentially there hadn't been a book done on the oil companies themselves. There have been many very good books written on the geopolitics of oil, larger issues involving crude and peak oil and the uses of oil. But there had not been a book looking at the individual oil companies and the oil industry. Well, there is the 1991 book that most of you who follow oil are probably familiar with, The Prize by Daniel Yergin, a classic book on oil. If you haven't read it, you should look at it. I definitely quote it in my book. Really considered a Bible on the oil industry. But the problem with The Prize is that, one, it was written in 1991, and a lot has changed since then. And the other is that Yergin will be the first to admit he comes from within the oil industry. His perspective is from within the oil industry. And so there really hasn't been a critical analysis of this industry done since 1975, and the classic book by Anthony Sampson, The Seven Sisters, which I highly recommend. So while the oil industry has really, in recent years, and particularly since probably 2000, and I'll get back to that year, really consolidated its power and its influence and its wealth, influencing, of course, everything that is so pressing on us right now, the economy, climate change, war, who are our policymakers and the functioning of our democracy. We, those of us who are concerned about these issues, which I imagine is everyone, don't know very much about who the companies are as individual actors, what their agenda is, what they are hoping to see in the future, how they hope to get there, where they come from, and what their agenda means to us. And so I set out to fill this hole. And essentially, as I described in the book, to pull back the curtain on the oil companies and look at where they plan to take us, where they hope that they will take us in the future. And of course, couldn't be a more critical moment to be looking at these issues in the midst of this incredibly important election. And believe me, the oil companies know that this is an important election as well. within the last week, this became the most expensive presidential election for the oil and gas industry in the history of elections. The previous record had been set in 2000 with the election of Bush and Cheney. The oil and gas industry had spent more money trying to get Bush and Cheney elected than they had spent on any previous election. Palin and McCain just topped that. $2 million just to the McCain-Palin ticket just from the oil and gas industry. So they think this is a very, very important election, and I think that we all do as well. So what I looked at was, in the title of the book is The Tyranny of Oil, and the subtitle is The World's Most Powerful Industry, and what we must do to stop it. So the world's most powerful industry, where I come up with that subtitle, is that I am equating profit with power. And what I did was look at the largest corporations in the world, which by and large by profit also happen to be the largest oil companies in the world, also happen to be the largest companies in the United States. Among the largest companies also happen to be the largest oil companies in the United States. And I looked at ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, Shell, and then I added Marathon and Total in there because those are the largest oil companies operating within the United States. Did I say Chevron? Chevron, yeah. And what I first did was just look at their power. And what I found was that essentially since 2000, well, let me back up for 1 second. I think most of you are aware, and has gotten a fair amount of attention, that in 2003, ExxonMobil became the most profitable corporation in the history of the world. Adjusted for inflation period, ExxonMobil became the most profitable corporation ever. It then topped those profits in 2004, topped them in 2005, topped them in 2006, topped them in 2007, and it's set to do it again in 2008. The recent decline be damned. They're set to top their records. All the oil companies are. But that's just one company, right? So when you add up all of the companies, which have all been doing better than they've ever been doing, you get hands down the most profitable industry, period. There is utterly no comparison at all. And it doesn't matter what industry you add up. Defense, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, what are industries that people might think could have very high profits? It seems like they might be higher. Software, telecom, no. Agriculture. Garment industry. You are the first person who has suggested the garment industry. No, not the garment industry either.
I'm wrong too.
What? What did you say?
Just joking. I'm
okay.
wrong too. Defense contract.
Defense. So defense was the one that I had thought initially, right? So no to any of them, and if you come up with any other ideas, you already know they'll be wrong. I already premised that, so sorry. It's a nice way to make you all feel stupid. So defense industry. I ran out of defense companies to add up to get to the profits of just the 6 most profitable oil companies. I ran out of pharmaceutical companies. I ran out of telecom companies. There just is no comparison. The only industry that came close for a time was the nation's banks, right? And they're not really competitors at the moment. However, it is worth noting that the 2 investment banks that have survived the financial crisis are Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Now, does anyone know what those 2 banks have in common? They have survived by morphing into oil companies. These banks own oil fields, they own tankers, they own pipelines. They also, more importantly, own the exchange on which crude oil is traded. More on that later. And that is how they have survived. That is what's differentiated them from the rest of the banking sector. So we have the banks, we have the oil companies, and then we have the banks that are sort of oil companies in drag, teaming up with them to be the industry that survives. That is the most profitable. And as I say, even I was startled to see this profit and how it didn't have any comparison within other industries. But it's not just that it doesn't have a comparison within other industries, because what I then was looking at, what was most important to me, was this issue of policy, right? How does the power of this industry, how does the profit translate into influence over our policy decision making? So the other then important comparison are other groups that have interest in policy and influencing policy. So let's say you're interested in, environmental concerns or worker protection or human health and safety or wars and human rights. And your interests are represented by a group. Well, one of the largest groups in the United States, most well-funded, is, for example, the environmental movement. And the nation's largest environmental organization is the Sierra Club. Now, does anyone have any guess on the Sierra Club's entire annual budget for 2006? Any idea? Any guess?
25 million.
25 million. 36 million was their annual budget for 2006. Sounds like a lot of money, right? Their whole budget. Okay. ExxonMobil's profits in 2007 were $40 billion with a B. Now, with the oil industry, when I talk about profit, what the oil industry says when it's pulled up in front of hearings in front of the House and the Senate, and the House and the senators say, you make these really big profits and we think that's bad. They say in response, well, yes, we do. We make huge profits. But we need those profits because we have such a capital-intensive industry, right? We have to spend a lot of money. It costs a lot to explore for oil, to refine oil, to produce oil. So we need these big profits. Now, I just want to throw that out there because that is what they always say. And to me, it just makes me cringe because I think even the young girl sitting on her father's lap there might even be able to explain to all of us here how you calculate profit, right? Profit is you've taken in your revenue and you've spent all of your money on all of your capital expenditures, all of the exploration, all of the production, you've spent it. What's left over at the end is profit, right? It's your cash on hand. And so ExxonMobil's cash on hand at the end of everything was $40 billion compared to the Sierra Club's entire $36 million budget, right? And so why I am equating power with that profit, which is uncomparable to any other industry and certainly uncomparable to any of the work that we do, is what they do with it and looking at how they influence policy. So I did a chapter which I continually refer to as the democracy chapter. It's not, it's really the anti-democracy chapter, and it's about how big oil spreads its money around. Particularly relevant right now when we are dealing with an election year, right? So the most obvious way is the one that we're most familiar with, campaign giving, right? We can look at how much money the industry gives to different candidates and compare them. It's $2 million to McCain-Palin, as I said, about $500,000 to Obama-Biden. And in general, the oil and gas industry is a Republican industry. This election season, they've given about 77%. That's actually slightly out of date. I think it's higher now, closer to 80%. Although now that the election is turning, maybe it'll go down. So let's stick with 77%. 77% of their money to Republicans, and that's a standard outcome. It's different within companies, so you see much greater extremities within companies. So, for example, ExxonMobil usually gives about 90% to Republicans. Chevron's a little more liberal. They're based in California, so there's a lot more Democrats there. So they usually give about 86% to Republicans, and that's usually how the companies sort of fall out. But campaign giving is, of course, limited. It is exactly limited. You can only give so much, and it's watched, it's followed, it's put in newspapers, people pay attention. So campaign giving is essentially a drop in the bucket to the amount of money that they actually use to influence policy. The next big chunk is lobbying, which I think folks would anticipate. But you might not anticipate how much is spent on lobbying. So ExxonMobil spent 14 times more money on lobbying between 1989 and today, 14 times more than it spent on campaign giving. And that's a standard ratio for the industry.
Can you briefly define for everyone
define what lobbying is? What that money refers to is the amount of money that they've actually paid out to lobbyists that either work for Chevron or lobbying organizations that go and try and influence elected officials' positions on a bill that's in front of them. That's the definition of lobbying, an actual bill that's up for consideration.
And it's like person to person, right? Like they talk to the senator.
It doesn't have to be person to person. It doesn't have to be an individual lobbyist. It can just be lobbying. So they have to count if they do a commercial, if they print out material, if they spend time at hearings. All of that contributes to the industry's attempt to influence the outcome of legislation. And that is very powerful. And as someone who's worked for two members of Congress on the Hill in Washington, D.C., I can personally attest to the weight of that presence. It is always there. It is always trying to influence you, and it's always, most importantly, although this is illegal, trying to lure you away, to give you promises of greater, greener pastures once you leave your government gig and get a job working for big oil or working on behalf of big oil. So I tell the story of Senator Nichols, who was a senator who was the head of a key Environment and Energy Committee in the Senate. He took in some oil and gas money while he was in that position. It doesn't look like very much on paper. When he left and immediately set up his own lobbying firm, which became the primary lobbying firm of ExxonMobil, BP, and Chevron, that's when he took in the big, big bucks. And that is sort of typical. Lawyers who spend 2 years working on the Hill doing some pretty important work for the oil industry, who then go to work for law firms representing the same firms, making 10 times, 100 times more money than they were making on the Hill. That is a very important type of influence, again, that we, for example, in the NGO community have no comparison for. We can't promise you $1 million salary after you've worked on the Hill, and thank goodness, as payback for doing good stuff for us while you're there. But that's just one layer. The next layer is then who they pay to do lobbying for them in addition to their own lobbying. So the United States Chamber of Commerce is the most represented in terms of money, spends the most money lobbying the federal government of any body before the federal government. It spends twice as much money as the next lobbying group, which is the American Medical Association, twice as much. Now, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as the oil industry has grown in wealth and influence, that money has poured into the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And if you look at the policy agenda of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it now immediately resembles that of the American Petroleum Institute, which is the primary lobbying group for the oil industry. But the Chamber is not only influential on the federal level, it's at the state level and the local level. Then you have groups like the American Petroleum Institute. Then you have the groups that we don't even know until it's too late, essentially, that are being funded by the oil industry. So this is a critically important device that ExxonMobil really mastered. And that was the well-placed use of the front group. So for a very long time, I'm going to exaggerate these numbers, but there were essentially 3 scientists, let's say, who believed that climate change was not a real phenomena. They were called climate deniers, and there were 3 of them. I'm exaggerating. And there were 3 million, but this proportion is accurate, 3 million scientists who said climate change is a real phenomena, it's very important, it's very disturbing. But for some reason, the views of these 3 were put on par and as equal to the views of these 3 million. So we all thought, well, wow, there's a real debate there. I'm not a scientist. How am I supposed to know? If the scientists are debating, who am I to say that this is or is not a real phenomenon? Let's wait till the scientists figure it out. And it seemed like there was this grand debate. Well, it turned out later, we've learned, that ExxonMobil alone spent about $15 million funding those 3 scientists, but behind front groups, such that Senator John J. Rockefeller, the great-grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, had to write a letter to the CEO of ExxonMobil to beg him to stop funding the climate deniers so that we could actually start taking real action on climate change. And if that isn't a bizarre twist of, history, I don't know what is. Finally, that has been exposed, and we've kind of gotten to a more sound debate in this country. But that was from front groups. Then another area to look at is at the state level and how they influence state level policymaking, which is important for you all right now on your ballots. I tell the story of Proposition 87 in California. This was a proposition that we put up 2 years ago. Now, California is the third largest oil producing state in the country. We have all the largest oil producers in our state: Exxon, Occidental, Shell, and Chevron. And we also, as you may know, have the richest state in the country in terms of how much wealth resides in our state. However, you may also know that very recently we just barely escaped asking the U.S. Treasury for a $7 billion bailout for our state, right? Because we're completely broke. And I would argue one of the reasons why we are completely broke is because we've essentially abandoned the concept of taxation. We don't tax the wealthy and we don't tax corporations within our state, essentially. And we spend money and we don't take money in, and so we're going broke. And so we, as citizens, tried to implement just a teeny tiny tax on the oil companies when they remove oil from the ground so that we could get a little something back for the oil that we have. Well, this idea, when it was first introduced to California voters, 65% of them said that they thought it was a great idea. Within 5 months, the proposal was voted down. In between, it became the most expensive ballot initiative in the history of the United States. The oil industry spent $100 million to defeat this one initiative at the state level, and they were always ready to spend twice more, 3 times more, 5 times more. One, they didn't want to pay the tax, but they also wanted to send a warning to any other communities or any other states considering proposals against them, to tax them, to regulate them, of what they can expect. And I interviewed the communications director for this proposition, and he said the problem that really happened was that when we launched a campaign against big oil in our state, Californians had no idea that big oil was our adversary. You never saw a Chevron CEO at a press conference. You never got a flyer in your mail from ExxonMobil. But it was the oil industry that funded the entire campaign, the $100 million campaign to defeat the measure. But they did it through front groups, and they did it through groups like, so for example, they funded a group called LEGC. It doesn't stand for anything. It's a research group, a quote-unquote independent research group, which released a report which is critically important as we look at federal discussion right now on oil policy and state level policy. Because what the report concluded independently, and we didn't know it was funded by oil money until much later, was that what would happen if the tax was passed is the one thing that scares Americans more than climate change, more than wars for oil. Their gas prices would go up, right? And this is a very, of course, valid concern, right? I'm not belittling this concern. But it turned out, as I say, that LEGC, all of the money that it had received to do the report was from the oil industry. And that we did not know that at the time. And that economists who argued that it was completely a spurious idea, one, that gas prices would go up, this teeny tax on the world's most profitable companies would have no impact on their bottom line. There's no reason why it would impact the price of gasoline. And more importantly, the study found, and this is another thing that the oil industry argues constantly, if you try and tax them in your state, is that they would leave, right? They would leave the state and not take advantage of your resources. They would go somewhere else. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, right? If a company like Chevron is facing off against armed mercenaries every day in Nigeria to get oil, and if a state like Alaska, which has the highest taxes of any other state on the industry, thanks in no small part to Governor Palin, if they have the highest taxes anywhere, are oil companies running away from Alaska, afraid to work there, not willing to work there, or are they clawing tooth and nail to get into Alaska, right? This was a completely spurious argument, but the industry convinced us. Very similar in the way, for example, that the majority of the American population was recently convinced that it was a good idea to eliminate the moratorium on offshore drilling. This was a moratorium that had stood for 27 years. The oil industry spent heavily on advertisements, but you might not have known it was the oil industry. There was a group called Energy Tomorrow that did a lot of advertisements. I don't know if you saw them. They were all over my state. Energy Tomorrow is the American Petroleum Institute. There were, more importantly, in many ways, campaign contributions. So McCain, when he reversed his previous opposition to offshore oil drilling, he got his first huge influx of oil industry money. And unfortunately, Senator Obama, who I support, also reversed his previous opposition to offshore oil drilling, also got not nearly the same amount, but a nice influx of oil industry money in reversing of that position. And we eliminated the ban. Now, the ban, I will get into this a little bit later, but let me just say here, the ban is very important. One of the reasons why the ban is important is because, no, I'll just do it now. So first of all, it's very, very expensive to drill offshore. It costs about $120 million per hole. They use diamond-encrusted drills. It's very fancy, technologically very difficult process. But it's also, in the words of a Chevron executive who I quote in the book, quote, a total crapshoot. We have no idea where the oil is. We have to drill, so out of 100 holes that you drill, 20% will yield oil. That's the reason why even the Bush administration says it'll take 10 years for offshore drilling to yield any sizable amount of oil. But Governor Palin and Senator McCain in particular say that's okay, start now, let's get the oil. We're going to need it in 10 years. It's true. So let's get it. But Governor Palin also makes this claim, which is this term she uses called clean offshore drilling, right? Which is just like when you hear this term, I want you to think clean coal. It's the exact same concept. Clean offshore drilling is an anachronistic phrase. There's lots of reasons, but for one reason, every single hole that you drill that is 500 feet or deeper, every single one, and now they drill at 1,000 feet, 5,000 feet, releases methane. Now, methane is a greenhouse gas 20 times more climate destructive, 20 times more than CO2. And remember, 80% of those holes are dry holes, yet every single one of them is still releasing methane. Every single one of them is disturbing the soil where the drill takes place, all of the marine life, and every single one of them, by the way, is so most of the oil rigs that we have right now are in the Gulf, right? The Gulf also happens to be this place where we have these things called, hurricanes. Hurricane Ike, when it just went through, 500,000 barrels of oil spilled because the offshore rigs have a tendency of breaking off and floating away. And they leak oil when they do that. The other reason why offshore oil drilling is not necessary and is a bad idea is because of a phenomenon that we have in the United States, which is consolidation and control within the oil industry. And there's a reason right now why Governor Palin, Senator McCain, 2008, the 2008 election began with Senator John Edwards being called the populist candidate for president, right? Do you remember this? Then Senator Clinton was called the populist. Then Senator Obama was called the populist. Now Governor Palin is being called the populist. Senator McCain, every single time he starts his speeches now, talks about how the rich and wealthy need to be held to account and we need to get money back to the little guy. And he's talking like a populist, right? The reason why they're all talking this way, and they are, is because our economy is in such a remarkably similar condition and position to where it was during the populist movement. In the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, corporations were allowed to merge, gobble up competitors, push out rivals, use any tactic, any mechanism available to form these massive conglomerates, which were referred to as trusts. And the biggest trust of all, the most powerful, the most dominant, was the Standard Oil Trust. And people all around the country organized in opposition to Standard Oil, not just because of its monopoly power, but most importantly, what they were most upset about was the political control that Standard Oil was able to exercise over the U.S. government due to its size. There's a cartoon that I discuss in the book from this era that shows the U.S. Senate, and seated 30 times larger than the senators and top hat and tails, and taking up the whole Senate room basically is the Standard Oil Trust, the Copper Trust, the Wheat Trust, but the only one that's given a name by name is Standard Oil. And there's a sign that says the Senate of the monopolists, for the monopolists, by the monopolists. And over way in the corner is a little door that says People's Entrance, and it's bolted and locked. And this is what people were upset about at the time. So people around the country organized in the populist movement and the progressive movement, and they convinced the Democrats and they convinced the Republicans, and Theodore Roosevelt became the trust-busting president, right? And they changed state laws and they changed federal laws, and ultimately, while many of them sought revolution, what they got was regulation. The first regulations on U.S. corporate activity in the United States history. So the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, the first campaign finance laws. And it's been said that if the Standard Oil Trust was called the Standard Oil Corporation, we would have anti-corporation laws in the United States. But instead we have antitrust laws. A set of laws put in place with a focus on Standard Oil to say if we don't want companies to get so big that they can control the government, we're going to break them up. And Standard Oil in 1911 was broken up by the Supreme Court in 34 separate pieces. And basically it's taken about 100 years, and the most important sort of moment of change was during the Reagan administration, when the Reagan administration abandoned antitrust law and said it doesn't matter how big companies get. It only matters how big they get if they can affect price. Otherwise, we don't care. It's not our business. And what happened then was a huge merger wave. If anyone's seen the movie Wall Street, you know what looks like, the outcome of this. A huge merger wave, lots of consolidation, but most importantly in this industry, 2,600 mergers just in the U.S. oil industry alone. And the biggest ones were the pieces of Standard Oil. The two largest pieces of Standard Oil, Exxon and Mobil, merged into one company. We have then Chevron, which bought Gulf, it bought Texaco, and it bought Unocal, one company. Conoco and Phillips merged. BP bought Amoco and Arco. Shell bought many other smaller pieces, and those are just the big ones on top of all the little ones I'm not telling you about. And we allowed these behemoths to grow. And they then turned their attention on two sectors of the U.S. economy that they had essentially not cared about until the mid-1980s. And these were until the 80s and the 90s and into this century. These were the U.S. refining industry and gas stations. So now we have a mass consolidation in just a few corporate hands of the refineries in the United States and the gas stations in the United States. There hasn't been a new refinery built since 1976. Today there are 50,000 less gas stations than there were in the 1980s, even though until very recently we were producing more cars than we produced babies, right? There's a lot of cars on the road and a lot fewer gas stations, but they're owned by fewer hands. The industry also has maintained control over about 13% of the world's oil. So what we've got is mass vertical consolidation and control of the industry essentially in a way that hasn't been seen since Standard Oil. So they control oil from the field to the refinery to the pump. And they control about 30% of the price of gasoline at the pump. Now, one of the things that they started doing was that 13% was good, but it wasn't yielding them the type of profits that they wanted. So in 2000, remember I told you I was going to get back to the year 2000. In 2000, the oil industry joined with the banking industry and Enron to lobby the federal government to deregulate crude oil futures. Now, if you guys remember, and also key crude and key energy trades. Enron was the first to use the deregulation, the first casualty of which was the West Coast energy crisis. Remember? Remember it? I remember it. In California, we lost our two largest public utilities went bankrupt. We had rolling blackouts. Companies went bankrupt. People lost their jobs. People were in their homes with no electricity, no cold water, and very bad things happened to individuals. Enron made out like a bandit, right? And their profits went up, and they then imploded upon their own greed. The mechanism they used to mess with our energy markets was this deregulation, which allowed them to set up Enron Online, their own energy trading facility. Okay, they then crashed and burned. But the Enron energy traders live on. They now work for Chevron, BP, the oil companies, the banks, and they trade crude in the same way they traded energy on their own exchange, set up by, remember I said I was going to talk about this in the beginning, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, BP, Shell, and Total own their own crude oil exchange based in Atlanta. And that's where they trade crude, completely deregulated, and they started in 2000. 2000 is also when the price of oil started to go up. But when the price of oil really started to go up was 2006. 2006 was the precise moment when the number of crude oil trades on the unregulated exchange ICE exceeded the number of trades on the regulated New York Mercantile Exchange. And this is how they got their profits way up. Then, through the consolidation of the refineries and the gas stations, they controlled how much they charge you. And they controlled supply. So I'm getting to the end. Why the offshore oil drilling doesn't matter. Because it turns out right now in the United States, we have a massive excess of supply of oil and gas. This is not to say that peak oil is not an incredibly real, incredibly pressing reality. It is to say right now, particularly in the United States, we have a big excess. And we have for a while. Since about 2006 in particular, the oil industry, what it has chosen to do is export more oil and gas out of the United States because it's been more profitable for it to send them out of the United States. It's also had excess of, this is all described in the book, of course, in much greater detail. It's a little hard to explain quickly. Stocks of oil sitting in barrels. And those stocks have been growing higher. And the reason why they've held on to their oil stocks is because until very recently, oil tomorrow was worth more than oil today, right? They were holding on to it. They were shipping it out of the United States. And they were choosing to refine less of it into gasoline. So gasoline stocks have gone down, while crude stocks have gone up. They've chosen to refine less of it. And they've sent more of it out of the United States. So they are the ones who make the decision as to whether your gas price goes up or down. The price of crude is the primary determinant, but after that is whatever the oil companies want to do. So for example, right now, we've seen a pretty big drop in the price of gasoline. Some people have noted that in the past, there has been a trend that often, prior to elections, sometimes the price of gas seems to drop. Now, one argument that might lend some credence to that, looking at what's happening right now, is something in the industry that they refer to as the rocket and feathers effect. So what the rocket and feathers effect is that when the price of crude oil goes up, the price of gasoline rockets up right away, right? You've noticed this, right? It goes right up. But then when the price of oil goes down, the price of gasoline slowly feathers its way back down. Well, recently, just now, price of oil went up, price of oil went down, price of gasoline went down, right? That's unusual. Might have something to do with what's going on right now. Okay, so if we drill more offshore and if we get more oil, my point is it might sit in storage barrels and that might be really great for the oil industry. They might export it out of the United States, and that might be really great for the oil industry. But will it add energy security here? No. Will it reduce your gas prices? Only if the oil industry decides to refine it into gasoline and lower your gas prices. But those are two big ifs dependent on the oil industry. Okay. The bottom line of the book, and there is the history chapter. There is a chapter looking at essentially where does the oil industry want to go. And this is broken into two. Environmental impacts of where the industry wants to go, and then military impacts, wars for oil and future wars for oil. The bottom line of the environmental chapter and the war chapter is this. The oil industry do not believe their hype, has no intention whatsoever at all, period, in becoming an energy industry. And we can talk about this in questions if you'd like. I've gone through all their tax returns. They are not invested in alternative energy, and we can talk about that. Where they intend to go is to the reaches of our environmental capacity to let them get oil, but they believe that we'll let them go there, offshore, in the shale regions of the Midwest, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, in the tar sands of Canada. And they believe that we will let them pursue all of the conventional sources of oil that are out there. And those are concentrated in just a few areas: Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Africa, a couple spots in South America. And they believe that they will be able to influence policy through the power that I've spoken of to get those resources, to lock their hold onto it. And what I propose then in the last chapter, which is the alternatives chapter, is that we should not choose to follow them down that path, and that we should restrict their ability to influence policy to make that happen. And I propose a whole bunch of, I connect you essentially to a whole bunch of great organizations, locally, nationally, internationally, that are working on all the ways of transitioning us from oil. Consumption is the most important issue. But the question is how to have our government help us in that process. Invest in public transit, invest in alternatives, make it possible for us to transition. And so to help facilitate that, I propose two ideas. One is breaking up the oil industry. Take a page from the book that's already worked and follow that. But that's small. The other is to help, just a tool to help us influence policymakers. And that is calling for the separation of oil and state. And this is a campaign by a group called Oil Change International, which is based on very successful campaigns against the tobacco industry that did the same thing. Essentially make it toxic for elected officials to be linked to the oil industry, make it bad for their careers, so that they renounce oil industry money. When this happened with tobacco, what was the result? We didn't eliminate the tobacco industry, but we did regulate it for the first time. We put really critically important limits on its activities. And if we can do the same for the oil industry, then we can limit where it goes, regulate its activities, stop it from going everywhere it wants to go, make it clean, make it greener, make it safer. We're going to still need the resource, so how to control how we make use of it, and most importantly, capture the wealth from the price of gas and the price of oil to invest it into alternatives. And so we call for all elected officials or those running to renounce all oil industry money, and for all of us to personally commit to voting for the least oily candidate out there. So thank you all very, very much for listening to the talk. Thank you. And I just want to throw out, I have a website. It's tyrannyofoil.org. There's a lot of information I know that I've thrown at you, a lot of information in the book. Believe me, it's way more digestible maybe in the book than it is in a talk, but it's such a critically important moment. I couldn't resist bringing all of this to you. Hopefully it was useful. I'm also still on tour, so please look at my website and look at the places where I'm going, and please tell your friends about where I'm going. And let me take questions, and then I will sign books. Thank you all so much for being here. Yeah, back there.
The first member of the audience to comment on the author's talk observed that everybody talks about corporations, but corporations can't do anything. They can't do a single thing. CEOs can act. They can do something. So the only way that you can stop it, and the way that they stopped it years ago, was with a 90% cap in taxes on anything over a certain amount. A 90% cap in taxes on CEO pay. That shuts it down. That's the only thing that will shut it down.
Well, thank you. I would certainly disagree with your proposition that that's the only thing that works. I've been an activist way too long to think that there is a one thing that works for anything. But if you wouldn't mind, have a seat and let me just continue answering your question. But that's a great idea. You know, whatever modes of activity we can do is great. I certainly wouldn't agree that capping CEO pay would be the linchpin for shifting the behavior of an entire corporation. And I've certainly seen, for example, board of directors tend to have influence, other executives tend to have influence.
This audience member followed up by insisting that this has to be imposed on the CEOs, that you have to cap their salaries to stop them from stealing, with a cap that stops their salaries from getting any higher.
I think it's a great idea. It goes into what I talk about as sort of a grab bag of proposals that we can all reach into to try and change the behavior of these different actors. And I think it's a good idea, yeah.
The next member of the audience asked whether the oil companies would just sit back and allow their influence to diminish, or would they rather fight back and indeed escalate their control over our government.
Wouldn't they get ruthless? Yeah, or are they just going to let this happen? So the first thing is, while I have painted quite a, shall we say, tyrannical portrait, they don't get everything they want now. They've got more money than anyone's ever had. If an Exxon CEO was standing up here right now, he would certainly tell you all the things that he doesn't get that he wants, right? I can tell you all the things he wants that he doesn't get. We do win battles already. We do limit their activity in many ways already. What we have on our side is that the American public, first of all, one, is deeply concerned about all of the issues, for example, the economy. Remember when the recession began? It didn't begin with the banking crisis. It began when oil reached $100 a barrel and gasoline prices shot up. That's when the recession began. That's certainly when the global recession began. People are very concerned about this. People are deeply concerned about climate change. They're deeply concerned about war. And most people believe that the war in Iraq is a war about oil. And the most hated industry in the world right now, in the United States, is big oil. In fact, it's never been, the poll numbers for how much people dislike big oil are the highest negative ratings the poll takers have ever taken on anyone hating any industry ever. You get what I'm trying to say. However, people don't then hold the industry accountable for individual actions, right? People aren't able to connect their sort of hatred of the industry in general with individual actions, individual policy. And when we do that, the thing that we have is numbers and influence. So there's a reason why Chevron right now is spending so much money on commercials, right? They are just permeating the airwaves, certainly where I live in California. And there's a reason. One is they are losing on two critically important legal cases. For 9 years, they tried to keep a case, and this also gets to your question of will they get tough. In Nigeria, Nigerians have accused Chevron of murdering Nigerian civilians, mass murder of Nigerian civilians, in an attempt to keep resistance in Nigeria down against their operations. And this case has been in Nigerian courts for 9 years, and Chevron has tried everything it can to keep it in Nigeria because they're so afraid of what will happen if the case comes to the United States. Well, the case has come to the United States. On October 27th, today, in San Francisco, the jury trial opened on Nigerians who have come into the United States to testify every day against Chevron about what Chevron did in their country. And this is why Chevron is permeating the airwaves with commercials. The other reason is that in Ecuador, for the largest environmental spill of oil in history across the Ecuadorian Amazon, caused by Texaco, now Chevron, the Ecuadorian court is about to rule a $16 billion judgment against Chevron. That case began in New York. Chevron successfully got it moved to Ecuador. And their argument that Chevron is making is that it doesn't matter what the Ecuadorians rule. Even if they rule we owe them $16 billion, we don't care. We don't have to abide by it. It's in Ecuador. And they want you to not be upset about them when that happens. And most importantly, on this issue of the green propaganda, they want you to keep using their product, right? They want you to think that when you fill up with Chevron, white daisies are blowing out of your car, right? That it's an investment in green energy because they invest in green energy. They also don't want you to vote for candidates that talk about taxing them, eliminating their subsidies, so that we can invest in alternative energy. Because why would we need to do that if Chevron is already doing it themselves, right? So if you believe their propaganda, you won't do that. They are afraid of our influence. They are afraid of our votes. They are afraid of our legislators. They're afraid of us not using their product. They are afraid of us getting in Richmond, which is near where I live, where Chevron has had a refinery for 100 years, a green mayor got elected. And boy, are they afraid of her and her influence. So our power is in our organizing, our mobilizing, our educating, and our capacity to influence each other and our legislators with our movements and our organizing capacity. Yeah.
The next comment from the audience was about the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the recent Supreme Court decision to reduce the damages that the oil company would have to pay from a couple of $2 billion to around $15 million. Yet the damage to the region affected by the oil spill remains. They got away with killing an entire ecosystem. The Supreme Court recognized that they had ruined the livelihoods of thousands of people, that they had deserted the entire town, and yet the court decided that it wasn't such a big deal.
Mm-hmm. I go into the Valdez ruling from the beginning to the end, looking at what happened with Valdez and the ruling. You're right, an enormous loss. That is because the Supreme Court right now has been stacked with people. Their rulings, in particular, on things like, what's the term? When corporations are supposed to pay damages. Punitive damages is the phrase I'm looking for. What's so important about this ruling was that it was essentially trying to eviscerate the entire concept of punitive damage, to take a big chunk out of the idea that corporations should have to pay damages for the harm that they caused to the people the harm was caused to. Also, this Supreme Court is filled with people who don't believe in antitrust. That is one of the reasons why this election is so important, because 2 Supreme Court justices are most likely going to be the result of it. This is a particularly conservative, corporate-focused Supreme Court. We've had them before. We have also undone them before. We have actually changed the makeup of the Supreme Court. We've changed the makeup of policy making at local levels, at state levels, at national levels. The reason why we had this crash is because things are now as bad as they've ever been, right? It feels like they are because they are. And we all feel like there's so many things weighted on top of us because it is as bad as it's ever been. We really are there. We have the greatest inequality in the United States since before the Depression. We have a government that is essentially, I would say the Harding administration is the closest comparison to the administration that we have, and that's when the Treasury Secretary was Andrew Mellon, who owned Gulf Oil, right? And however, we have had an enormous crash, and the American public is wide awake in a way that I've been an activist for a long time working on these issues. I have never seen people reading the fine print of subprime mortgage, derivative trading legislation, calling up their representatives, demanding that they not vote for the first one. That was huge. It's sad that we voted for the second one, but the reason why the first one didn't go through, there was only one reason. That was the calls the candidates got from you guys. That was the reason. That's enormous. That doesn't happen in the United States. It's happening right now. So when Alan Greenspan says, I was wrong, when Christopher Cox, who's the head of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, says corporate self-regulation doesn't work, oops, sorry, we are in an immense moment of opportunity, right? For change, for implementing policies that we haven't had the opportunity to implement before, for ideas that we haven't had the chance to bring up before, for organizing that we haven't had the chance to do before. And to see this as an opportunity to come back against things that are really, as bad as they've been. Okay, yeah.
The next question from the audience was whether the author thought that the government might regulate refineries for security, for safety, for continuity of production, and to address the fact that these refineries are aging and deteriorating.
Yeah, are there refineries near Portland?
Ontario and Richmond.
Well, near me. I'm just curious.
Burn up and raise
Yeah.
the price of gas twice.
So I have, I go into refineries in the book, looking at basically there hasn't been a new refinery built in the United States since 1976. The reason why is because the Clean Air Act passed in 1976. And the Clean Air Act stipulated that any new refinery built had to use the cleanest, safest, available technologies when it was built. And the expectation was that new refineries would be built and they would be clean and safe. Well, there was a catch. There was a grandfather clause. All existing refineries were grandfathered in, under the stipulation that if the refinery refined a significantly larger amount of crude, or if it significantly increased pollution, it would have to retool to use the new technology. So what the industry has done is essentially not significantly increase the amount that they refine, and even though they have increased pollution, argue that they're not increasing pollution, and have done a little bit of retoolings, but essentially they're just making use of these very old, decrepit, 100-year-old refineries that are all located. The number one determinant for where a refinery is located in the United States is race and ethnicity. The second determinant is economic status. So low-income groups of color are where refineries are located. And the one near where I live is in significant noncompliance for air pollution, for water pollution. We had an explosion a couple months ago that caused a massive explosion of sulfur into the air. People got automatic phone messages that said, close your windows, close your doors, and don't breathe the air. And the cause was a 30-year-old pipe that wasn't replaced and should have been replaced. This is one of the areas where I call for massive necessity of regulation, massive regulation. And just the argument that these are the wealthiest corporations in the history of the world. Why shouldn't their refineries be glistening, brilliant examples of the safest, cleanest, most efficient, secure operations in the world? Why shouldn't they be? What's the argument for why they shouldn't be? And to have a call for that. But the other thing is, in terms of how regulation works, right? And I'll end here. If we ban offshore drilling, one of the things we're doing is saying, so Chevron in 2006 spent $600 million on the most expensive offshore drilling rig in the history of offshore drilling rigs, $600 million. That is twice as much as they spent in that year on green energy alternatives, the whole year. If we ban certain activity, we close off those expenditures. We say, you're not going to spend $120 million for every hole you drill. We're just going to ban that activity. And then we're going to say, and we're going to regulate you, so you have to make your refineries cleaner. And what we're doing is we're saying, we don't want you to spend money here. We want you to spend money here. This is in the social interest. This is not. And that's how regulations and policies work, right? And these are tools we have. These are things we can do. The next thing then you have to do is enforcement. And then it is our job to be constantly vigilant, right? We can't just say, okay, we passed the law, go do it. We have to organize. We have to be vigilant. We have to watch. We have to look out for each other. We have to make sure the changes happen. And that's the secret, right? We can't say, oh, it's over there. Oh, it's working fine. We have to be engaged. We have to organize. So with that, thank you all very, very much for being here. I will continue to answer questions while I'm signing books. And thanks very much for coming out.
You've been listening to author and journalist Antonia Juhasz talking about her latest book, The Tyranny of Oil, the World's Most Powerful Industry, and What We Must Do to Stop It. In addition to her latest book, The Tyranny of Oil, Antonia Juhasz is also author of The Bush Agenda, Invading the World One Economy at a Time. To find out more about Antonia Juhasz and her work, please visit her website at www.thebushagenda.net. This program was produced by PDxJustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. you'll find free online streaming video and audio programs featuring speakers such as Phyllis Bennis, Francis Moore LePay, Paul Krugman, Kevin Phillips, Noam Chomsky, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.